What's the important thing? So I'm gonna give you a heads up right away. If you notice those white things that are hanging above your heads, those are microphones. So we can record your conversations and report them to the authorities.
Yes.
No. So this is. Men in dark masks showing up at your door. This is for the benefits of the live stream. So these are fire mics, and I'm fiddling with the volume level on them a little bit. So if you're watching this from home, and it gets distracting because you can hear other people besides me talking too much. Giving feedback to them. Otherwise, they should be working. And I apologize for the extremely loud noise. That's what happens when you power the mics when the volume going to the mains is still on. Because I don't want any of that. Just twiddling them out. Okay. So I have made some decisions regarding several things. So we're going to be starting a new class on the creeds. And today and next week, we're going to be talking about the history of the creeds. And then on the 18th, Linda is going to come in and lead us in an exercise to create our own version of a creed. And I thought about it, so I met with Scott Stoper last week. Scott and I are going to be co-teaching a course on civic responsibility. He's going to talk about his experience and his knowledge, both as a political science major, but also as the city reporter for the city of Milwaukee. So that's going to happen during the summer, but we're not going to start that one until June, like the second or third week in June. So what I decided is I'm actually going to string this out a little bit longer, but specifically because once we're going to do history these 2 weeks. We're going to do the writing project on the 18th, and then the remaining 3 weeks, what I want to do is dig into each of the articles of the creeds and talk about what they mean in contemporary context. So we're going to talk about where they were derived from contextually, historically, and what they mean from a contemporary context. So it'll just be more classes on the creed, but I'm talking about it in a fancy way, if that makes sense. So what I gave you is a printout of the 3 creeds that the Lutheran Church holds to be authoritative. And so we've got the what we refer to as the Apostles' Creed. We've got the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed. I just realized we rarely ever say the Nicene Creed at Milwaukie Lutheran. We should probably do that at some point. But we never say the Athanasian Creed. I can't remember a time in the history of things that we did it. I think growing up at Lutheran, sorry, I'm putting my dad back. I feel like we maybe did it once for like a Holy Trinity Sunday or something like that. But, I mean, that's a mouthful. That is a mouthful. And not to mention, all 3 of the creeds have pieces that are very contextual to the time in which they were created. Well, it doesn't cause complications, but it's something to think about. That's what we're going to talk about in the next few weeks.
I really like the creed you say.
The new creed one? Yeah. Well, it's interesting this morning because
But it's not official like these.
it's not held to be officially authoritative by the denomination. No. But it doesn't mean that it's not authoritative. And that's what we're going to talk about. Is what that means. Why does our church have specific statements of faith or held to be authoritative? What that means in historical context. Okay. Before I launch into the creeds specifically, let's do a quick early Christian history review. Been a couple classes. So early church. Post Jesus really starts to form around the 60s and 70s, right? So that's when we have our first gospel being, one of the first gospels. That's when Mark comes about. It's about 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And then spaced over the next 20 to 30 years, we get the other 3 gospels. and John most likely being written towards the end of the first century. The majority of the Pauline epistles, so the letters that Paul wrote, he wrote between 60 and 80. During his journeys abroad. Okay? So if you think about it, Christianity is in the process of being formed as a thing over that space of about 30 years. So by the time we get to the end of the first century, so 100 Common Era or AD, that is kind of the mark of where Christianity has become Christianity, or is becoming Christianity, isn't just a Jewish cult anymore. Okay? And if that language is uncomfortable to you, that is specifically how the Romans thought of Christians, was just yet another Jewish cult spin-off, because there were lots of them. And so Christianity, around that end of that first century, is when we finally get something along the lines of a cohesive identity shared amongst the people that are following Jesus. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay. So one of the pieces that's interesting, and we're reading through the Gospel of John this year, is the Gospel of John is a really great kind of a snippet in time of watching that happen, where John is the Gospel that is written during the formation of this Christian identity, over and above just being, I shouldn't say just over and above being Jews who are following. I should. Come on, you know.
I just wanted to go through this.
Hi, Cheryl. Drive safe.
I'll be back in a minute.
Sounds great.
All right.
You made a brief appearance in the live stream.
The church up here is not like you, but I can go.
I call the check every week. And I've talked about this before. So John is a really great kind of like insight into what that looks like. One of the cool things about John is John has a lot of new metaphors and imagery, right? So John is responsible for, the vine and the branches, the streams of life, all these kind of metaphors. The lamb, right? Jesus is the lamb. These are all metaphors that John kind of sees. And it makes sense in the picture of things because what the Christian community is doing is they're beginning to develop their own imagery, their own metaphors over and above what is Jewish. And again, there's more going on there than just people changing. It's also new people coming. It's the merging of Jews and what they refer to as Gentiles. That's actually a much more complex thing, which we know from studying Revelation, because Gentiles covers the entirety of Asia Minor through Western Europe and North Africa as well too. Gentiles is everybody else. So that's also affecting the Christian. So creeds, where do they come out? Any ballpark guesses as to when we trace the history of the Apostles' Creed to? 200? Okay. Any other? Again, I apologize for fishing for a tape. No, you're both in the same ballpark. So the Apostles' Creed, most scholars would say mid-second century. So 150s. Okay. In this form as we have it, that's where we trace the Apostles' Creed back to. We talked about it in early Christian history, but the Apostles' Creed is actually derived from an earlier creedal statement that we refer to as the R statement. I need my whiteboard. No, that was more me just realizing I didn't have anything to do with it. So the R statement was kind of a proto-Apostles' Creed. And we don't necessarily have the full version of what the R statement was, but we hear it being referenced to. Okay? And the reason it's called the R statement is because it originates in Rome. Very, very creative with our naming systems. Okay, so the R statement. And here's what's really, 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 really important to understand about the R statement, and especially because it later becomes or evolves into the Apostles' Creed, is the here that the R statement is used is on Easter Vigil at baptism. And it's not said by the community as a statement. It's asked of the candidates for baptism as a question. So it's never said by the whole community, like we read the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father, Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth, etc., etc. On Easter Vigil, after a year of preparation for baptism, the candidates for baptism would be asked 3 questions. And each 3 of the questions correspond to the true person of the Trinity. That was the form in which this early creed took. In fact, the way in which the creed is used for the beginning of the history of the church is only in that format. It isn't actually until much later, potentially by 150 or even later than that, that as baptism moves away from adult-only candidates who explain during preparation to infant baptism, where you can't ask the infants questions, only then does the creedal statement become detached from baptism and become basically something that's used as a statement of faith by the church. Are you tracking that? Okay? So this is a very important thing to understand, is that the creed's earliest use were essentially as a way of inducting or inviting people into this moment of baptism. Keep in mind that early Christian worship was not exclusive to those that weren't baptized. It was just broken into 2 pieces. You had, in the beginning, the service of the Word on Sunday mornings, where the Christian community would gather together, they'd read from Scripture, there might be teachers, and then, after the end of the service of the Word, you would have the service of the meal, where those who have not gone through baptism are invited to depart. The community that has been baptized shares the meal. But then, after they have shared the meal, they then distribute the food back to everybody, including those that haven't been baptized. So then, the food is sent for widows and orphans and all those who rely on the Christian community for support. Okay? So again, the creedal statement in this case is used only in that context of baptism. Now, go ahead, please. Yeah.
So the baptism service, is that similar to the our statement?
Similar, yes. Well, in fact, for see today, first thing we do is we ask the sponsors and the parents if they're bringing their child willing, if they are presenting their child, their children for baptism. Then the very next thing we do is we do that exact form. We say, do you believe in God, Father, Almighty? I believe in God. But everybody does, not just the family. And that likely is how it would have been done in the Christian community, the early Christian community too. This wasn't just the candidates for baptism. They would have done it in the context of the entire community saying, which would have been a very powerful event for the community, because every year when you have new candidates presented for baptism, the community is reaffirming their faith in these statements. We only do it once a year. Yes, to answer your question, we do mimic or mirror that in our practice, accidentally or intentionally. I assume it's probably somewhat intentional. We do something exactly like too. But here's another thing that is really important to understand is that all of the creeds, whether it's the Apostles' Creed or the R statement, or the Nicene Creed, or the Athanasian Creed, are actually not necessarily intended to be a statement of faith that I proclaim independently. They are direct responses to theological questions that date to the time in which these creeds were formed. We would refer to them, they would refer to them as heresies. Okay? So these statements of faith, these creeds, are created as a way of reinforcing in the Christian community, we're not about that. If that makes sense. From a modern perspective, that inspires a lot of heresy theorists that would argue that the early church was quashing diversity of belief. But again, what's going on is the church is figuring out who they are. And to be fair, when we talk about the heresies, especially the heresy that formed around the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, which is the Marcionite heresy, which essentially advocated that the world is an evil place. God of the Old Testament doesn't apply. Human beings are evil people, and it's only through the goodness of Jesus that anything could possibly be redeemed. That you have statements in the Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed articulating that God, through Jesus, creates the earth, right, and creates it good. In other words, all creation comes from God and therefore cannot be evil. Whereas the Marcionite heresy really wanted to create a separation between those two concepts, which, ironically, we see in some theologies in our modern era. People talking about the sinful world, the broken world, the fallen world. And I find it so ironic that 2,000 years ago we were trying to get rid of that, and it rears its head again and again.
So this is
another really important thing to understand about the creeds, is that in their origins, they were not people that were trying to formulate a faith statement which summarized the totality of Christian faith. They were statements that were meant to speak against specific theologies that they found to be unhelpful. Does that compute? Right? So question for you. How are those things different? Because it's funny to me because and I've done this with confirmation kids. At the end of the confirmation, there gets confirmation kids together and say, okay, you're going to write a faith statement. And what do they all do? Every single one of them. They paraphrase the Apostles' Creed. To a T. They paraphrase the Apostles' Creed. And it's ironic because what I'm asking them to do is I'm asking them to summarize their faith. And ironically, they're going to a document which was not meant to summarize faith. It was actually meant as a response to all of the things that would have fallen outside of Christian teaching at that time. Yeah, that's where we are. And it doesn't mean that we're wrong. But these are all the things that the more we understand about them, for me, the more informative and more helpful it is. Right? Okay, let me ask you a question. Do you believe everything that's in the Apostles' Creed? Door's over there. No. And you don't have to respond out loud. You can just nod your head and avert your gaze.
Well, there is a, I don't know how widespread it is, but a concern over calling God.
Sure. That's a very valid concern, I would argue as well too. So what does that mean for you, Linda?
Well, when I say, I believe in God.
You degender the
why is that important to you?
Why is that important to you?
Oh, I guess because of
I guess because
feminism,
of my
back in the
feminism,
70s.
back in the 70s.
Sure.
And who's to say?
Who's to say
If God was
if God was a
non-int, non-gender.
Yeah.
Well,
And it's funny because it really digs down into that. We're essentially asking the question, what genitalia? I always argue we should just get straight to the point. When we talk about gender and English regarding God, we're essentially asking that question. Of course, it's more complex in the modern world with trans and different expressions of gender and sexuality.
And to be fair,
there are people on both ends of that
issue that are very fervent.
Generally, what I hear from people who really advocate for gender language is that, well, that's what's in Scripture.
Sort of.
which was
Which was written by men. It doesn't change anything.
It doesn't change anything. Yeah.
And it really would be more appropriate because gender is large.
Yes.
Well,
And if you really want to make it complicated, let's talk about gender identity and gender roles over the course of 2,000 years of human history and how those have changed, especially in the last 50 years. Thank you to our feminists in the world. In terms of women working
and men working.
I grew up in a household where my dad had a sugar mama.
We were talking about
My dad was a stay-at-home dad for most of our early childhood. we referred to them as our slave masters.
Made sure that we were pruning.
Made sure that we were pruning the trees and picking them up.
But that's
But that's a very much a gender reversal, which also my grandfather, my dad's dad, was the one who
So
took
now
it.
I find myself.
So now I find myself, a year older, 2025, being the only cook in the household. It's not that my wife can't cook, it's that I take that responsibility on
Which,
gladly.
can you imagine that?
Can you imagine that being the case in 1950?
So, again.
So, again, when we talk about gender language, and
His,
he,
her,
his,
all
hers, all that,
making assumptions.
we're
about
making
what
assumptions about what that means,
Very
and that might have been a
different
very different thing to the people who wrote this language originally. Go ahead, Steve.
Not only did, yes.
Not only did,
absolutely.
yes, absolutely, the Yahweh was intentionally
Ambiguous, both.
ambiguous, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of what
It expresses, so
it
Yahweh.
expresses. So Yahweh is in some. I should ask my friend Dan. I don't know
Is
this.
connected, so when Moses
Connected.
asks God,
So when
what's
Moses
your name?
asks God, "What's your name?"
God says
Moses said, God says Yehiya,
Kind of a,
which is kind of a what's the opposite word?
it's a,
Anyway, similar place to God. Yehiya, I am who I am. I will be. It's not even
I
tense.
was who I was,
I was who I
So in
will
other
be.
words,
So in other words,
Moses asked God for God's name.
Moses asked God for God's name, and God's like,
whoever I
I
want.
am whoever I want to be.
Which
I would read to include man, woman, anything on, whatever that means in terms of genitalia or physical expression of gender.
God refuses to be.
God refuses to be boxed into that.
In all the Francis,
Yeah.
I think that was a huge.
I still haven't seen it.
I still haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's-
Oh,
Yeah.
and is like,
Gut punch.
Well,
Gut punch?
because it talks about it. And it, you gotta see it, Jesse.
I know.
I know.
mean,
Len wants to see it too.
you go see it,
how they do all this and
how
then
they
the end
do all
comes
this, and
to,
then the end
and who have they chosen,
and who are they,
a male or a female.
a male or a
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
They're really pushing the boundaries.
They're really pushing the boundaries of the Catholic Church.
It's a huge shock.
That's cool.
That's cool.
That's cool.
Well, I would say it's a
Well,
question being
I would
asked.
say it's a question being asked in our broader
And
culture.
the question that's
And
been asked
the question that's been asked in the Catholic faith for
thousands of years.
And so
thousands of years.
So what-
Multiple.
Yeah, Francis expanded
Yeah,
upon it.
Francis expanded upon it, but they still can't be priests.
The author discussed a few weeks ago, the wording analyzed the
Oh.
translation.
Oh.
The rib stuff.
The rib stuff.
And God, we are created in God's image, and that story would have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the initial Adam.
Well, the initial Adam, and again, this is
Fascinating
a
etymological.
fascinating etymological question, right? Is that
The word
the
Adam.
word Adam, for which we anglicize it.
How many kids have been named
How
Adam?
many kids have been named Adam over the course of
Adam was.
Adam was
Adam.
Adam because Adam came from Adamah, which was
So many.
many modern translations will not translate with Adam as birth gene or birth.
So what you get,
So what you get, so that I can't remember, I forget this woman's name, it was a woman in the early 20th century wrote a theological treatise analyzing the use of gendered language in the Bible and how we miscontextualize a lot of it. Specifically, the story that she is struggling with is the story of Adam and Eve. Specifically, that the word, when they pulled something out of Adam to create Eve, since King James, we have translated it as a rib.
But she went
and did a word study across the Old Testament, which is what you do, because you don't have any other ancient texts that have Hebrew in it, so you do a word study. Compare how that word is translated elsewhere in the Old Testament. Never ever translated as rib. It's almost always translated as side. So in other words, one part of the whole. And so she advocated that talking about Eve being created from the rib is hierarchical, right? It's saying that Eve is created from the part of Adam, who is the whole being. I'm putting my language in her mouth, but she's essentially saying that it's more along the lines of cell division, right? Where you take Adamah, you split Adamah in half, and you get Adamah and was Ish and then
So
Isha.
they changed the name of the
So they changed the name of the creature.
So
So as soon as the cell division happens, you no longer have Adam. You have Ish and Isha. Ish is one and Isha is the other. And then eventually, again, this is a lot of this is whoever was editing these documents, they ended up passing together to create Genesis.
Then switched back
to Adam and Awe, right, which is the name of the woman. And then because the Germans got a hold of translation in the Middle East, it became Eve.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Oh, there's so much more there.
Well, there's so much more that we could spend a lot of time talking about. The word for the serpent is the same word for nakedness.
It's a very similar.
Well, it's a very similar word for nakedness and shame. So,
Hike by people.
like people. Thank you.
So, yes.
So, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the modern translation of the Apostles' Creed.
So, we're going to get to that.
We're going to get to that because that line particularly
It's actually,
Dennis and Jackie. I don't know if they might be back down in Arizona.
Dennis
Bordette asked, can we do a study on that one? The descent.
So we're going to talk about that.
So we're going to talk about that the week after, so the 25th of May. We'll talk about that.
Because it is interesting.
Because it is interesting in that.
The language being changed.
The language being changed, also asking the question, what exactly did these early Christians think?
What were they articulating?
What were they articulating when they articulated?
Knowing that it's all
most of this is a response to other questions, what were they responding to with that?
Well, Linda's gone.
Well, Linda's gone now, temporarily.
Oh, good question.
Lutherans and Roman Catholics
These three
hold these three to be authoritative.
Here's where it gets interesting.
Here's where it gets
So
interesting. We've
we've
got
talked about the Apostles' Creed.
we've talked about the
When
Apostles'
does the
Creed.
Nicene Creed
When does the Nicene Creed come about?
325.
325.
Council of Nicaea.
Council of Nicaea in 325. So, doesn't have any juice in it.
Okay, and the Nicene Creed.
Okay, and the Nicene Creed is the one that specifically responding to Nicene heresy, by the way.
So take a look.
Take a look at the Nicene Creed, and there's some, little do you know, there is some serious conflict with
So
this.
what happens is.
So what happens
So
is,
keep in mind. So
keep in mind, this is right after
all the stuff with Constantine.
all the stuff with
We talked about
Constantine. We
Constantine.
talked about Constantine at the end of the
century.
3rd century,
So
and
it
all
starts
the,
at the
so, it starts at the Tetrarchy and at the Mission, who was the, or
Bishop Laurentius.
one of the two guys that were one of the Tetrarchs, get power hungry and want to make Rome great again, and expel all the immigrants and
Purify the blood of the
purify the blood of the Romans and all that wonderful stuff that eventually usually leads to genocide. Starts a conflict, tries to gain power for himself. Constantine, who was one of the sons of the Tetrarchs, ends up gaining power for himself, and then eventually wins out over this guy by and the other Tetrarchs by rallying by using the Christian cross as well. Probably this is probably wouldn't have been the cross. Probably would have been the Cairo. Not the capital. The Cairo.
So literally
So literally Chi and Rho. Anyways,
was Constantine Christian?
was Constantine Christian?
He knew the power of the symbol.
He knew the power of the symbol. Not for sure.
And he may have
His mom definitely. Saint Helen definitely. Constantine then
takes over the Roman Empire.
And
Again,
does not create Christianity as the state religion,
pulls off
all the restrictions. And what happens then is, over time, Christianity swells to become the majority religion in the Roman Empire, and then is later made the state religion, but after
The Council of
Constantine.
Nicaea
The Council on Nicaea is happening not too long after Constantine's restriction of Christianity. Christians can practice in public with little fear of retribution, no fear of retribution.
So it's an interesting snapshot.
Snapshot of time, because now they are doing the same thing that the early Christians were doing around the 1st century, which is saying, what do we believe and what don't we believe?
And the Nicene Creed comes
And the Nicene Creed comes out of that.
After
After the 18th, we will dig a little bit into, we'll talk about the Filioque.
This is the beginning
This is the beginning of the end
for the East and West
for the East and West churches being areas, amongst other things. In addition to the iconoclast movement and all the
One
other
word.
stuff. One word.
One word that's
One word that's
put
put into the Nicene Creed. End of the sun. Ends up being the
straw that breaks one of the
straw that breaks, one of the straws that breaks the camel's back.
Anyways,
So Nicene Creed is formed, and it's a direct response to the Marcionite heresy, and they're drawing attention to the idea that creation is of God, right? That creation is not a separate thing from God. There are plenty of other little pieces in the Nicene Creed that are also responses to theological questions of the time. Again, as we have time, we can dig into those. It gets a little bit tedious after a while. There's a lot of them that compares. I mean, that was 1,700 years ago when we got over that. But it's interesting. Where was I going with this? Nicene Creed, because you brought up, or somebody brought up something else. So,
what denomination?
what denomination? Thank you.
So here's the thing.
So here's the thing. So
Out of these three creeds,
as a ELCA Lutheran, or as somebody who's an LC, which would you say is the default creed?
The default?
Yeah.
The default?
Yeah.
Apostles' Creed. Yeah.
Apostles' Creed. Yeah.
Well,
You're giving the gold star answer. Paul.
Yeah, in terms of
usage, I would advocate that most churches use the Apostles' Creed.
But I like Nicene Creed better, but everybody likes the short.
You've nailed it on the head.
You've nailed it on the head. You've nailed it
And
on
we're
the
going to
head.
talk about.
And we're going to talk about
I'm
we're going to talk about the consequences of that as well too, which is what we mean when we say we believe, or everybody,
So, Catholic Church,
Lutheran Church, hold those three to be
the
authoritative.
Eastern Church,
The Eastern Church,
only
only
the Nicene Creed.
the Nicene.
They don't
They
deny
don't deny the Apostles'
the
Creed,
Nicene Creed,
but
is
the Nicene Creed is the creed
for the Eastern Church.
for the Eastern
Without the Filioque.
Without the Filioque. By the way.
What we refer to as
What we refer to as Orthodox Church. So during the Great Schism in the 10th, 11th century, you have a split between, so now there's a pope in Istanbul, not Constantinople, Istanbul, and there's a pope in Rome, right?
So the Eastern Church.
And so the Eastern Church has the Nicene Creed, singular, as their creedal statement.
Beyond that,
most mainline Protestant churches will use
probably the Apostles'
Nicene Creed. Actually, it has two and one because of two.
I don't think
I don't think I've
I've ever
ever said what they're using Nicene.
But the
Apostles' Creed Nicene Creed becomes authoritative up until the Protestant denominations. So most Protestant denominations will use at least those two. Not
the Athanasian Creed, we're not
the Athanasian Creed, we're not going to talk a lot about what we can
probably do that.
Again, we'll probably do that either next week or
The Athanasian Creed is yet
the Athanasian Creed is yet another response to get more dissent about the DISSENT about theology and what they deem to be heretical.
It's a wordy
It's a wordy
setup.
setup.
It
It really is. And the thing that I always beat my head against with it is it just seems like a lot of
It's
it,
just so run
like
on.
it's just so run on.
Like
Like it seems like they're like
it's repeating itself.
it's repeating itself,
Really
but it's
about,
really about
this creed is
this creed is specifically about
solidifying or standardizing
theology of
why,
which is why about the only time you'll ever hear the Athanasian Creed used, and I don't know use it,
is on Holy Trinity Sunday.
is on Holy
That
Trinity
is what
Sunday,
that is.
because that is what that is all like.
Here's what God the Father.
Here's what God the Father.
God the Son.
Here's what God the
Here's
Son
the Holy
is.
Spirit.
Here's what the Holy
They're not the
Spirit
same,
is.
but
They're not the same,
but they are one.
they are one. They're not, they're distinct but unified. You can see the language, especially in the whole long second paragraph, like,
The Father's
The Father is uncreated, the Son uncreated, the Holy Spirit uncreated. In other words, they both date back to the beginning.
Nobody created them.
Nobody
The Son
created
infinite,
them.
the Holy
The
Spirit
Son infinite, the Holy Spirit infinite, the
Father
Father infinite. The Father is eternal, the Son eternal, the
Yet they
Holy
are
Spirit.
not three.
Yet they are not three who are eternal, but there is one who is eternal, just as they are not three who are uncreated, not
There's
three who
one
are
who's
eternal.
uncreated.
But there's one who is uncreated. Right? You get the vibe, right? Can you imagine saying that one every Sunday?
Let's talk about
Oh,
zombies.
goodness, talk about zombies, you know, people zoning out.
Any questions so far?
Any questions so far?
We have a date for
Cynthia?
it?
Oh, I should have looked that up.
Oh, I should have looked that up. Here, I'll tell you.
It's like 7.
It's like 7th or 8th century.
Nope, 6th century.
Nope, 6th century.
500s.
So 500s.
Or the last statement is.
Five.
Last statement is free.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is the true.
Oh yeah, this is the true Christian faith. Whoever is not faithful in son who believe this cannot be saved.
Straight to the point.
Cutting straight to the point, aren't they?
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And
So.
in fact, if you.
And in fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page for the
They
Athanasian
have a
Creed,
diagram.
they have a diagram
That
that represents what this is talking about because it's so
This
concise.
is, well.
This is,
you
you wonder why people find it so off.
It's doctrine.
Doctrine and dogma.
Let's talk a little bit more.
Let's talk a little bit more about
the Apostles' Creed.
the Apostles' Creed.
Because in 2 weeks.
Because in 2 weeks, when Linda is in here, I want to kind of
Okay,
take this.
so.
Okay,
Linda,
so
you said.
Linda, you said, so I asked everybody the question,
Do you believe everything?
do you believe everything
Which are
in
being
the
a little
Apostles'
bit
Creed? Which are being a little bit simple.
Again.
And again,
It's,
it's,
I give you permission.
I give you permission
To think some of this.
to think some of this is weird.
Is there other, let me ask
Is
this.
there, let me ask this differently. Are there any pieces of the Apostles' Creed that you find that you struggle with,
Aside from the gender language.
aside from the gendered language?
Virgin, you were bringing that up.
Virgil, you were bringing that up, Cynthia. Yeah.
Have you ever read the Gospel according to Jose Saramago? Yes.
I don't know.
I don't know. That's a good question.
I don't think I have.
I don't think I have.
That would sound,
That
that
would sound, that would
I've also
probably.
heard
I've also heard that,
Mary,
Mary,
not only to be a virgin,
not only
her mother had to be
her mother had to be.
Oh, and this is where,
And this is where, well, this, by the way, is where you get
one of the places where.
Protestantism and Catholicism really bounce off each other.
Because it's not just.
Because it's not just the virgin birth, it's that Mary herself is without sin,
So it's the,
you know, and so it's the
perpetual
perpetual virginity of the virgin.
So in order for there.
So in order for her perpetually a virgin, she couldn't have had any other kids except
It's in the gospel.
it's in the gospel of Mark or Matthew.
Jesus
Jesus or James, the brother of Jesus, is
It's
identified.
fascinating.
And so it's fascinating if you read, so the Catholic Church put out a
For the first time
translation,
since the
for the
Bible,
first time since the
put out
Bible,
a
put out
translation.
a translation of the Bible.
60s or 70s, might have
In
been
the 60s or
60s.
70s, might have been earlier.
It's actually,
And it's
actually
actually
good translation.
a pretty good translation in terms of being
accurate to the
original language.
but the way that they
But the way that they address that is
so
footnotes.
when it gets to
So
talking
when it gets to talking about James, the brother of Jesus, it's a footnote that says,
many traditions
will hold that this is actually the blood brother of
in the
Jesus,
Catholic
but
Church we
in the
often
Catholic Church we often acknowledge that this is a stepbrother or whatever.
brother, it's
Or
brother,
it's a brother in a name or whatever, you know, it's that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. Joe Butler, Joseph had more
And
life.
I don't mean to
And I don't mean to diminish
But
the
that's
Catholicism,
one of the
but that's one of the fascinating pieces. Yeah, she's a perpetual virgin. How do you account for Jesus' brothers and sisters
Likely existed.
that likely existed because that would have been normal?
But and so just
But
speaking of
and,
the virgin
so just speaking of the virgin
this
birth,
is
right? This is where it gets tough because,
you ask somebody,
you know, you ask somebody, well,
do you consider yourself
do you consider yourself to be
Orthodox
an Orthodox Christian?
There's this fear.
And there's this fear if I say, well, I think the virgin birth is a bunch of, you know, baloney that they created to make Jesus
But then
special.
all of a sudden,
Well, then all of a sudden, the pitchforks and torches come out, and, you know,
declaring you
we're
apostate.
declaring you apostate, and,
We know we're not, obviously.
you know we're not, obviously.
So thank you.
So thank you.
Well, other pieces that you
Well, other pieces that you struggle with.
Paul.
This
Paul.
Apostles' Creed, is this from the Catholic?
from the Catholic
There is no,
Because there is no, because this predates,
Catholic
this
Church.
predates the Catholic Church, as the Catholic Church.
I'm just wondering.
Oh, you mean the Holy Catholic
Oh,
Church?
you mean the Holy Catholic Church?
Okay, but,
Okay, but, okay,
yes,
yes,
so,
yeah, so,
They added that on, huh?
they did not.
they did not, this is original,
Choice
well,
in
it's
translation.
choice in translation.
Oh.
Capitalized refers to the denomination that is the Roman Catholic Church. Small c Catholic means universal.
So when we,
and I'm glad you brought that one up, because this is one I would suspect people to bounce on.
oh, sure.
Oh, sure. Because it's semantics at the end of the day. Why don't we just translate it as universal?
Tradition.
Tradition, it's the way we've always done it. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's been translated.
Yep, it's been translated as a Christian church as well, too.
The quick and the dead.
Quick and the Dead. Great movie, by the way. Great Western. And here's the tough thing. Is
Yeah,
that,
Christians.
Christian seems like it would be a better choice.
But you understand that there are
But
churches.
you understand that there are churches who identify themselves denominationally as Christian
So
churches.
you can't
You can't win.
And that, by the way.
And that, by the way, is why a lot of the times
Translators and or
denominations will choose to stick with what has been used,
which is why we still use.
which is why we still use ribs in those translations. Because it has been used
the
consistently.
same way that we pick.
The same way that we pick the books we didn't pick.
That are in
The
the
books
Bible
that are in the Bible ended up being the books that are in the Bible because they were the books that were
Right.
used,
It was
right?
use
It
case.
was use case,
Justification for
justification for their conclusion.
But yeah, Catholic Church.
But yeah, Catholic Church, that's one I would expect everybody to bounce off.
And the use of saints, how would you explain?
Well, right here.
Well, right here, you have drawn a dividing line between, Protestant and Catholic.
What are saints for Catholic?
What are saints for Catholics?
People who did good work.
People who did good work.
People who did good work, went through the beatification
Are held
process,
up as
are held up as exemplars
Faith, righteousness,
of
justice.
faith, righteousness, justice, whatever.
Who are saints?
Who are saints from a Protestant perspective?
Forgiven sinners.
Yes, us.
Yes,
Most
us,
of the time.
most of the time.
That was drilled home to you.
That was drilled home to you.
Well,
Well,
interesting way.
that's an interesting way to read it, because I don't disagree with that. So one of Luther's major statements in Latin, simul justus peccator, simultaneously sinner and saint, or saint and sinner. One of Luther's big things is that all human beings are simultaneously sinners. Saints are forgiven sinners.
And it's a really interesting.
It's a really interesting statement to dig into because it's an acknowledgement of human nature, right?
Sometimes we choose to.
Sometimes we choose to do the right thing. Sometimes we choose to do the wrong thing. Sometimes we think we choose to do the right thing, and we
As
actually.
Paul said, I do not.
As Paul said, I do not do the thing I want to do. The very do not want to do. So when we say the communion of saints,
what do you expect that?
what do you expect that
in a Catholic setting?
in the Catholic setting they're
Claiming or
claiming?
Well, in
Catholic Church, you have to perform a
you have
miracle
to
to
be
be
a
a saint.
miracle to be a saint.
Yeah, one or three of them.
Yeah, one or three of them. I can't remember.
Which that question came up.
That question came up on Tuesday. How long is it going to take Francis to be
Yeah.
beatified?
There's no doubt.
Because there's no doubt that he will.
But then again, I see.
But then again, I see it as more of a political process than necessary.
But anyway,
So
for
Catholicism,
communion of saints, I'm guessing.
I'm guessing again, you have to ask somebody who
Let's talk about
is
the fact that
talking
there are
about
saints.
the fact that there are
Are
saints
intermediaries.
who are intermediaries between
God.
God and
What do we acknowledge?
what do we acknowledge? What do we claim when we say that?
What is the communion of saints for?
What is the communion of saints for Protestants?
That
We have been forgiven, but
We have been forgiven, but it includes
saints
the saints
on earth and the saints
on earth and the
above
saints
as well, too.
above.
So
too.
when we talk about
So
the
when
kingdom
we talk about the kingdom of saints, we're talking about the kingdom of all believers, and the kingdom of the resurrected.
So again,
So,
this is
you
like
know,
you talk
again,
about.
this is like, you talk about, do you believe in the Apostles' Creed? Well,
Depends, right?
depends,
A little bit,
right? It's a little bit more complicated.
This
It's just saying, this is the summary of the statement of faith of our church, because number one, historically, it wasn't intended to be that. It wasn't
I
intended to
imagine
be
if
that.
you had
I imagine if you had asked
the
leaders of Christian communities in the first century,
they'd still be working on it.
they'd still be working on it.
We're still working on it.
We're still working on it 2,000 years later.
Can you imagine?
Right? I mean, can you imagine if we did that? If like the two national trust sent out a poll asking all Christian denominations to send in their summary of the theology of the Christian
How that
faith,
would go over?
how that would go over?
Not good. No.
Not good. No.
It would be fascinating to see.
It would be fascinating to see the differences. Any other pieces of the Apostles' Creed
that you struggle with?
that you struggle with?
Okay. So let's talk about what.
So let's talk about what this is. Okay.
So either.
I
shouldn't say either. What we're not saying. Okay. Because we're not saying
necessarily that creeds are summaries of faith.
for multiple reasons.
For multiple reasons. Historically, that was not the original. Number two is,
can you imagine
trying to summarize faith of the ELCA?
Right? What's in?
Right? Do we have things that we learned today?
You want me to help or should I sit down? Do you want me to be in the audience? Do you want me to be in the audience?
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want
Okay. Do you want the microphone, September?
Okay.
Okay.
To Paul.
Do you want me to come hold the book for you?
Do you want me to come hold the book for you?
I can hold the mic either way.
I can hold the mic either.
Okay.
You get that?
Saul was a bully. Saul got blinded by Jesus. He went to Damascus. Ananias prayed for him. He was healed by Paul. He was healed. Paul spreaded Jesus' love.
Show you
Oh.
pictures.
So here's the book that they created.
Here's the book that they created, Saul to Paul.
Picture of Paul.
Got a picture of Paul on the cover.
And then Saul was a bully.
And then Saul was a bully. I like the representation of Saul as a bully.
Saul got blinded by Jesus.
Saul got blinded by Jesus.
Knocked down in the road
Knocked down the road
to Damascus. He went to
to
Damascus.
Damascus. He went to Damascus.
Ananias prayed for
Ananias prayed for
his
him.
prayers rising.
Is this prayer that rising up from heaven, or is that the road to
That's
Damascus?
fantastic.
That's fantastic.
Then
And then
he was healed.
he was healed. Paul spread Jesus' love in that.
Great job.
Great job.
Yeah.
Any questions for September?
What did Saul do?
What did Saul do?
What did Saul do?
What did Saul do?
Christian- Do you remember what he did to Christians?
Do you remember what he did to
Before he became
Christians?
Paul?
Before he became Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what did,
And what did,
why did
God
God come down?
God
or
come
Jesus
down?
from top
or
to
Jesus from
Saul?
to Saul?
In order to have a plan for them?
Or he had a plan for them?
So can bullies
So
change?
can bullies change?
Can people change?
Can people change?
What helps them
What,
change?
what helps them change?
Sometimes Matthew,
Whoopsies.
do you remember?
Remember?
What helps Saul turn
What
to
helped
Paul?
Saul turn to Paul? Turn to Paul.
Love. So that's how we can then
So
change
that's how we
big
can
bullies
change
with our love,
big
right?
bullies with our love, right?
Yeah?
Yeah?
I've got a few cabinets.
I've got a few cabinet positions. Thank you, September.
Yeah.
line to Acts 3.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. Remind me.
Absolutely.
We'll do it right at the beginning of the
We'll
service.
do it right at the beginning of the service.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alright.
All right.
Okay, so instead of asking
Okay,
a bunch
so
of
instead of asking a bunch of questions,
I wanna
I want to wrap up with, give us some food for thought as we go into next
Next
week.
week, we're going
Because next week, we're going to, like I said, look at the 3 different
articles of the creed.
articles of the creed as preparation for when Linda walks us through it.
Creed writing practice.
Creed writing practice is the word I'm
So-
looking for.
So the question is,
So the question is, what are creeds?
and
Okay. And how do we use them
are
in our worship practice? So
not asking you,
not asking you specifically,
but let's say you
but let's say you walk into
Lutheran church,
Lutheran church for a memorial service, and
the
pastor gets done giving his homily,
and we sing a
and we sing a song, and the first thing we do is I say, now let's affirm our faith in the words of the Apostles' Creed.
and you
And you don't really go to church, and you
What
open
does
it
that
up.
feel like?
What does that feel like to you?
Writing a contract.
Writing a contract.
Yeah, writing a that's
That's
a
a good analogy. Writing a contract, or signing a contract that you haven't gotten a chance to read the fine print.
So it feels like
So it feels like what we're asking people to do is agree with us. Again,
agree with us
agree with us
about what we
believe.
my
That's a fair representation.
Again,
Yeah.
the difference here
Again,
is what
the difference here is what
versus
people perceive versus what we are actually doing.
do you feel
Do you feel
on Sunday morning,
on Sunday morning,
which won't be this way,
which won't be this way this Sunday? Well, it will be, because I'm going to ask
do
you,
you believe in God the Father?
do you believe in God the Father Almighty, and then I'll ask you to repeat everything.
I'll ask you, do you
I'll ask you, do you believe in Jesus Christ?
Invite the response.
To invite the response on.
Do you feel
Do you
that this is
feel
a
that
demand
this is a demand
placed upon you
to conform to an orthodoxy?
Yes.
Yes.
And that's unfortunate.
And that's unfortunate.
That is really unfortunate.
That is really unfortunate
Because
because
in their origin,
these weren't intended to be summaries of
they
faith.
were intended to
They were intended to be
ways
ways of the community affirming what they were against.
Those
Okay.
contexts.
Those contexts no longer
These
exist.
words have been.
Right? These words have lived on past that context.
So one
So,
of the guys that I'm reading,
one of the guys that I'm reading as a practical is Justo
who is also
Gonzalez,
the guy that
who
wrote
is also the guy that wrote the book,
History of Early Christianity.
History of Early Christianity. He's fantastic.
And Justo Gonzalez,
And Justo Gonzalez, he makes this argument that really what the creeds are is they're a collective statement,
which is to say that
no one individual is expected to believe each line in it.
And the assumption,
And the assumption then is that when you have gathered a community of believers, you communally might believe everything in this. In other words, some of these lines might be challenging for some, they might be informative or even inspiring for others.
and it's not just that.
And it's not just the infinite monkeys writing Shakespeare. In other words, when you get enough Christians together, eventually you'll hit a critical mass where everybody believes
He's
together.
saying that the purpose
He's saying that the purpose of it is not about conforming to an orthodoxy. The purpose of it is that you are together saying, this is who we are. If that makes sense. So
some of those
language might be updated.
we talk about gender.
We talk about gendered language being particularly challenging from a modern perspective. Where we're discovering gender is not as simple as two expressions, or even that the
cultural
identity that we tend to associate with the specific genders is standard. So like that's just one example of ways in which this can be
But
challenging.
what we're doing
But what we're doing is not necessarily saying we all believe all these things or we collectively believe these things. It's that this is who we
This is
are.
our church. And
This is our church. And
this gets a little
bit nerdy in that it's kind of neat that we call it the Apostles' Creed, because the idea is it's not the creed of the original 12 apostles. Judas, obviously. At the time, Stephen as well, too. Stephen hit the rocks.
It's saying this is the creed
of the apostles of the Christian
now
church,
all the way
now and all the way back.
So this is
Right?
also
So this is also a historical statement thing, meaning that
these are the words that go
these are the words that go all the way back to when our creed was used to baptize Christians on Easter
and we
Vigil.
continue to
That
say
we continue to say, we're not asking people to conform to them as orthodox, but we're saying these are the words that represent our church over and over. Does that make sense? Which I make sense? Which I think is a beautiful thing.
Getting back to
Well,
what I
I
said
think that's
about
what it says, have trouble with God the Father.
if God, the
If
Father
God,
created
the
nature,
Father
why do we
created
call it
nature,
Mother
why do we call it?
I have to figure out the etymology of Mother Nature.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Language is so fun.
Language is so fun. I love it. I love picking apart
where
words,
they come
figuring out where they come from.
And so often,
And so often that we have assumptions about that kind of stuff that are actually complete.
yeah, why do we call it Mother?
Yeah, why do we call it
We
Mother?
just have Earth Day.
You know, we just had a birthday, not so long.
His
ago.
Father
And yet,
separated.
it's Father who created.
Yeah.
Yeah. Supposedly.
Yeah. All right, folks, thank you.
All right, folks, thank
Can
you.
I encourage
And I encourage you, if you get a chance this week, read through these.
We're actually
I'm actually gonna be studying on creeds today with my confirmation kid.
So
So,
we'll come back next week.
when we come back next week, I would love if you had some questions about any of these three. I can't promise that I'll have the answers, but we'll have some conversation.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.